In this video, we're going to discuss the human brain and some of the features of the human brain. This covers part of our option for neurobiology and behavior, and many of the images that are used in this video are taken from our Cognitive Higher Level textbook for biology. The nervous system is divided into two main sections. The central nervous system, which is composed of our brain and our spinal cord. And then the peripheral nervous system, which is divided into two sections itself, the somatic nerves and the autonomic nerves. So the somatic nerves involve our sensory and motor neurons, and those nerves are under voluntary control. So we can think about moving our arm, we can lift our hand to scratch our head and so on. We can move our legs. Those are all under voluntary control. Our autonomic nervous system is not voluntary, it's involuntary, and it's divided into two parts as well. The sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, which there's an extra C there. So the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for our flight or fight response. So if we're being chased by a bear, we'll either run away or we'll stay and fight the bear. So our body will make changes to help us get through that. And then our parasympathetic nervous system is known as our rest and digest response. So when we're not in danger, we are able to rest and digest our food and go about our daily business. So to talk a little bit more in detail about the central nervous system, it's divided into the brain and spinal cord, as mentioned before. And our brain has about 100 billion neurons, so that's a lot in the first place. And then there are many more specialized nerve cells that are called glial cells, and then their job is for support. So they don't send messages back and forth through the nervous system, but instead they support the neurons that do conduct the information and the signals. And then our spinal cord runs down the middle of our back, as you know, and it's surrounded and supported by the bony spinal column. You need to protect your spinal cord because it could be easily damaged, and it's protected with the spinal column. So some fun facts about the brain. The brain's about 1.5 kilograms in size, and that varies between people. Its surface is highly folded, and those folds are very important. Those determine our higher order thinking. There's, if you look at other mammals, they won't have as highly folded cerebral cortexes. The brain is also divided into two hemispheres, a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. And that's divided by the corpus callosum, which is a bundle of nerves that connect the two hemispheres. And a fun fact about our brain, the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body and vice versa. And then each hemisphere itself is divided into several lobes as well. And you'll refer to your brain diagram for the details of each lobe that we have in class. So the job of the peripheral nervous system is to collect and send information between the central nervous system and the rest of the body, or the periphery. So basically they're neurons that branch off of your spinal cord and then either collect information. So the sensory neurons would collect information from the different parts of our body and then send it back to the central nervous system for processing. And then our motor neurons, which we'll talk about, take that information on what to do back to the periphery. And then it's divided into, as I said before, the somatic and autonomic nervous system. So the somatic nervous system is under voluntary control, and it sends nerve impulses to and from the skeletal muscles. The autonomic nervous system is under involuntary control, and its job is to control the smooth muscles, the organs, and the glands. And like I said before, is responsible for the fight or flight response and the rest and digest. And it's divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. So parasympathetic is the rest and digest. Its job is to conserve energy when you don't need to spend a lot. and it will slow down processes that consume a lot of energy, like slowing down your heart rate, slowing down your breathing rate, but then speed up other processes that would be more appropriate to do when you're at rest, so digesting your food and so on. The sympathetic nervous system is responsible for the flight or fight response, so it expends a lot of energy because it's going to speed up any process that would help you escape danger and then slow down things that would hinder or inhibit your escape from danger. So this diagram kind of shows the difference between the two. So the parasympathetic nervous system, like we said, it was the rest and digest. So it would stimulate the flow of saliva to help you digest food. It will slow your heartbeat down to rest. It constricts your bronchi so it doesn't open up your airways. It's large so that you have to take deep breaths. It stimulates peristalsis and the secretion of enzymes and hormones. It stimulates the release of bile because you can digest your food, and it contracts your bladder. So if you do have to, empty your bladder, you'll feel the stimulation or the urge to go to the bathroom. And then the sympathetic nervous systems, when you're in danger, your pupils dilate so that if you're in a dark area, you'll be able to see better. You'll inhibit the flow of saliva. So that's why sometimes when you're like in a scary situation, your mouth goes dry because you're not needing to digest food. You accelerate your heartbeat so you can circulate glucose to your cells so that cellular respiration can go on. And so you can get energy to get away from the danger. You dilate your bronchi so you can bring in more air with each breath. And then you inhibit peristalsis and secretion. You don't want to have to waste energy digesting a meal when you need to get away from danger. You convert glycogen to glucose so it can be used in cellular respiration to give you energy. You'll release adrenaline and noradrenaline, or epinephrine and norepinephrine, and you inhibit bladder contraction. You're not going to want to have to, stop and go to the bathroom if you're trying to run away from a bear. So you won't feel the urge to go to the bathroom. So this is our diagram from our Cognity textbook. It's a section of a skull showing the brain within it. So you can see that the skull is highlighted here. I'm just going to get my pointer. So here's our skull. So it protects your brain within it. The cerebral hemisphere is up here. So those are all our complex functions. So the haughty folded cerebral cortex. So learning, memory, emotions. And it receives and sends information to and from the opposite sides of the body. So I mentioned that before. The hypothalamus is down here. It's the interface between the brain and the pituitary gland. It's kind of the control center. And remember, the pituitary gland is right here. The posterior lobe stores and releases hormones made by the hypothalamus. And then the anterior lobe, the one at the front, makes and releases many hormones. But their release is still triggered by the hypothalamus. The cerebellum is like a little brain. So this is it looks different than the other one, but still is highly folded. It would have developed first evolutionarily. Its job is for posture, movement, and balance. The medulla oblongata is at the top of the brain stem, and its job is for all the autonomic control of you. So it keeps you breathing, your food will digest, your blood vessels are controlled, your heart rate is controlled by the medulla oblongata, and then this would be your spinal cord going further down your back. So we weren't able to really know what parts of the brain did what until we could study the brain. So scientists would do animal experiments. People would do autopsies after somebody died. The study of brain lesions. So if people had injuries somewhere in the brain but survived, doctors and scientists would explore what was lost with that damage to the brain. We also now use functional and magnetic resonance imaging, so they can actually see an fMRI shows you what parts of the brain are active during different emotions or like during pain. So in this one, during pain, all these parts of the brain lit up. And when somebody was feeling empathy, those parts of the brain lit up. And that's because more blood flow is going to go to the area of the brain that's being active at the time. So an fMRI can show you that. One interesting thing about a study of brain lesions, there was a man named Phineas Gage who had a pretty horrific injury. He was using a tamping iron and it hit an explosive, and the explosive drove that pole through his eye socket and through his frontal lobe and out through the top of his head. And he miraculously survived, but his personality changed after the injury. So your frontal lobe is responsible for managing your emotions, and he was not able to manage his emotions in the same way. He used to be a timid and gentle man, and he got very angry more easily after the injury. So those types of accidents actually help people understand what parts of the brain were responsible for different functions. So the cerebral cortex is the outer, highly folded section of the brain, and we can see here the different parts. It's divided into lobes. So there's the frontal lobe. Right behind it is the parietal lobe. Behind that is the occipital lobe. And on the sides, near your temples, is your temporal lobe. And then your cerebellum is at the back and at the base. And then your spinal cord is here. One activity that you need to do from your cognitive textbook is to do section A.2.2. You need to annotate the brain for each of the functions, and then compare the animal size to brain size and note any patterns. So we've mentioned this already, but our brain is divided into two hemispheres. Each of them are connected by the corpus callosum, which is a bundle of nerves, and each hemisphere controls the opposite side of the body. So the left hemisphere, for instance, receives inputs sent from our sensory neurons on the right side, and then receives sensory inputs from the right side of the field of vision in both of your eyes. So that's something interesting. And then the right cerebral hemisphere receives the sensory inputs from your left side of your body and the sensory inputs from the left side of the field of vision in both of our eyes. This is an image to show you the different parts of our cerebral cortex that are responsible for what. So our visual cortex, each hemisphere has its own visual cortex. So the neural signals from the rods and cones, which we'll talk about later when we learn about sensory receptors, they're processed here, and they help us recognize patterns and help us identify how fast something is moving. So our visual cortex collects the information and helps us interpret what that information is telling us. There are some fascinating cases where somebody's visual cortex is damaged, but their eyes and their optic nerve are just fine. But because the visual cortex is not able to function, even though all the information is coming in, it's not being interpreted or processed. So a person would still be blind, even though their eyes and their optic nerve are functioning just fine. So Broca's area is part of our left cerebral cortex in this general area right here. It controls the production of speech. And if there's damage in this area, you might know what you want to say, but you'll be unable to articulate it. So sometimes when people have had a stroke on the left side of their brain, they will be unable to speak and articulate what they're trying to say. So the nucleus accumbens is the pleasure or reward center, and there's one in each hemisphere. And a variety of stimuli will cause the release of dopamine, which causes feelings of well-being, pleasure, and satisfaction. So those stimuli could be food, it could be something else that makes you happy, it could be sex, and also it could be drugs. So drugs like cocaine, heroin, and nicotine, they're addictive because they artificially cause the release of dopamine, and that's why you get a sense of euphoria or well-being when you use those drugs. And that's why they're addictive, because we like to feel good. We'll talk more about drugs in our neuropharmacology lesson. Another task for you to do is to go to Cognate A.24 and complete the task that's there. Basically, you need to identify the regions of the brain shown in each of the images that are in that activity. So, how do you determine brain death? So, the medulla oblongata controls the autonomic nervous system and the involuntary reflex responses. So, our pupil reflexes are also controlled there. We don't control whether our pupils dilate or contract. So if you were to shine a bright light in somebody's eyes, their pupils should reflexively constrict and narrow because the bright light they want to protect their eyes. And it's a reflex response. It's not something controlled by the higher order portion of your brain, like the cerebral cortex. If somebody's pupils don't constrict, this is evidence that brain death may have occurred. So if they stay dilated, even if you shine a bright light in, it's a sign that there's brain death.